Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see you. We are here. We are here at a time on a day with some things. And that's very specific, I know. But for those of you that couldn't derive any meaning out of what I just said, Kevin of Engineering Politics and I are here on our 11th episode of Revisiting the Road to Serfdom, going through F.A. Hayek's seminal work, just laying out totalitarianism and collectivism and how all collectivism basically leads to totalitarianism, and trying to figure out how we can map that book that he wrote. It was officially published in 1944, but I guess inception of it was probably maybe even 15 years prior to that. But how we can map Hayek's thoughts onto today's context. And this chapter is one that, I don't know if we'll even be able to get through all of it today. I hope we will. But that, we go back and multiple times, Kevin, you can certainly speak to this, of just like, we get to these moments and we're like, how crazy is this that he was able to call this or explain this thing? It's always, whenever you're thinking about something or perceiving something and someone puts words to it, you go and you're like, yes, that's it. That's what I'm talking about. That's it right there. It's really meaningful. And Hayek is able to do that with so many different aspects of our current culture and where we're at socially, and politically, and so on. And this chapter, to me, is, there are moments like that throughout all of these chapters. But this chapter, to me, has the most that you're like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. Like, this is, and we'll get into this later about how there's parts where it's like, I don't even know how to distill this down. I don't know how to summarize this, because there's no way to do that without diluting the message and the truth there. So the chapter we're going over today is like I said, chapter 11, which it's called The End of Truth. And I think it's no coincidence that chapter 11 is also bankruptcy, in the legal sense. And, the idea that we're in an intellectually and morally bankrupt, society today, and that whenever you get rid of truth, that's how that happens, where you're at a place where you're morally chapter 11, I think is no coincidence. But that's that's my brief introduction there. Kevin, is there anything else you add? Today's been a day. A lot of it's my fault of even just delaying getting started. I locked the keys in the truck that I was driving up here in Bozeman, and I ended up having to walk 6 miles, a little over actually, to get back here and delay this. But here we are. So I don't know. It feels like this is going to be a somewhat loose, but hopefully as in depth as we can kind of conversation. I don't know. How are you feeling right now, buddy? What are you thinking?
Well, I think
how you doing?
You hit on some key points there that keep coming up for every chapter. One, this chapter where we're going to cite some bulk paragraphs, something we haven't done much in the past, but you said it's like you don't want to miss any of these key details. To me, it's like you can paraphrase Shakespeare, or better yet, just read Shakespeare if you want to get the whole, context of how he writes and the beauty in what he writes. And it's kind of the same with Hayek in a lot of these parts. Like, sometimes you just have to quote the whole paragraph, because there is no better way to paraphrase what he's saying. And like you said, you feel really vindicated. And it's like, we've talked about a lot of these ideas before. I think there's some stuff in here. We talked about one of our first conversations, which is about the Overton window, or the asymmetry of the Overton window. I think he touches a lot here. So it's like, someone as brilliant as Hayek can say you were right, except for, it was 1944. It makes you feel a little bit better, right? It feels
Sure.
like, oh wow, we were actually onto something. We're not just talking and listening to our faces make noise. It's important to know that you're making connections with people who saw these trends in the past. And I think that was a large message that he tried to convey in this book. He started out by saying Nazi Germany didn't end up as Nazi Germany because the Germans are German. It happened because there was a slow, gradual trend toward this. We need to recognize it before we repeat those mistakes. And too often today, and he hits on this toward the end, too often today do we think, well, maybe they had some ideas, not Nazis specifically, but certainly with the communists and socialists and stuff like that. Maybe they had ideas that were really good, but as we read about in the last chapter, chapter 10, which is how the worst get on top, those ideas fell apart because bad people took over. It was just the bad people. It wasn't the system. It's just the people. So let's, repeat some of those steps and go into this with no humility, no respect for what people learned in the past. And let's just do it all over again, see what happens. Yeah. And then we get surprised when we end up in the same exact spot. The horrible people get on top. And it's like, well, maybe people who, wrote during the time, 44, he's writing this throughout World War II. We talked about the courage you have to write this because you kind of don't know how it's going to shake out in the end. There was certainly some uncertain times during World War II where if you're, if you're in, the UK, if you're in Britain, it's like, I don't know if I'm going to be speaking German in 10 years or what's going to happen. And if I write a book coming out saying the Germans had a bad ideology, how does it look on me? How quickly can I get out of this country and go somewhere else? Right. Yeah. So I think you hit on some important details there. And, this chapter, I think much like that last chapter, just has so much in there that is so relevant today. And, we're repeating a lot of the themes today that we were doing back then, or that other countries were doing back then. And that's why it's so important to repeat and revisit this material. We call it revisiting the road to serfdom. We need to revisit some of the trends that happened back then to see, to make sense, to frame what we're seeing today, and identifying it's how you fight it. And so I think that's really what we're trying to do today.
Yeah. Before you get into the summary of the last chapter, you mentioned Shakespeare. Did you see that the thing with Romeo and Juliet in that play where they had to hand out the disclaimers and stuff to people beforehand? Did you see this?
No.
I saw this thing on Twitter last night where someone went and saw Romeo and Juliet. I don't remember what city it was in. They're all the same these days, or for the most part. And they had to hand out a thing to people ahead of time where it was like, Juliet does not actually kill herself. Like literally it was this, this might be traumatic for people thinking about suicide and violence. These actors don't actually die. They didn't actually kill themselves. And then also between every single scene, they would go into this monologue about patriarchy and women's rights and stuff. And this was written 400 years ago, and the tweet was like, how stupid are people? They're literally telling people, hey, don't worry, you didn't just witness a public suicide. Seriously, yeah. It was that bad. So
reminds me of a Snow White where they got to say he did not get consent before he kissed her.
Yep, it's true.
So, let's be careful, tread lightly when we repeat these old stories. It's much better.
Cancel Prince. What was his name? Prince, whatever, William.
Yeah.
I don't know. Who cares? Whatever. It's all the same.
Right. Yeah.
Cancel Prince.
Whoa.
Purple
Too soon.
What was last chapter, Kevin? Speaking.
Right. Yeah, last chapter. So for those of you following along, we're doing basically a chapter a week now, chapter an episode. We started out being able to do a couple per episode, but we actually did something special last time where we got to do a live kind of Q&A, and we got to talk about everything live, where
we answered so many questions. Thank you guys.
Yeah, we did. It was a little bit of a scramble last second to do the live stream, but we did get to talk about all the material that we covered in chapters 1 through 10. So check that out if you haven't already. So you have to go back 2 episodes to go to chapter 10, which is why the worst get on top. I already talked about it a little bit already, but just to review that real quickly. One of the main points that we got while reading The Worst Get on Top is that many people believe that failed governments is a result of bad people coming to power. They don't believe that the problem is with the system, but rather they believe that any system can really work if managed by good people. But as Lord Acton alluded to at the beginning of that chapter, that it's a concentration of power a system gathers that corrupts the good people and attracts the bad people.
What's the Acton quote? You want to give the Acton quote really fast for people? Everyone knows it. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, we got to stop thinking that it's the good people. If there's good people who are in the system, good people running, it's the real socialism hasn't been tried line, because they always claim bad people took over too early. No, it is, we asked everyone while we were going through that chapter, keep asking yourself, why do the worst get on top? And your answer becomes more clear every single time we move further in the chapter. And I said, by the end, you're asking yourself, why wouldn't the worst get on top? Because it's just the natural conclusion to the progression of a lot of these systems that either, like I said, that they concentrate power here. And when you concentrate power, I mean, that is the absolute power corrupts absolutely.
I think it was power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, yeah.
Anyway. But sorry. Yeah, no, good clarification. So the next part that we saw in there, and something I'm actually going to bring up today, is the difference between the moral basis and the moral results. That goals are not the same as outcomes. So what they do is they'll use this moral basis. They'll say it is immoral to have poor people. Okay, therefore we must redistribute wealth. And then the results, the moral results, is now everyone is more poor because you've screwed up this incentive system. You got rid of the free markets. Now people don't have as much choice. They're not as involved, or they don't want to be as involved in their work, which just leads to, it sinks all ships rather than raises the ships that were, sinking to the bottom. And they claim that, it's, since we had a moral basis for this, we can justify the immoral results. And that's something that we'll see continue throughout this chapter. The theme will be continued throughout here. The third thing that we pointed out is collectivism inevitably becomes particularist. So all collectivist movements need something to rally behind. So that's where the particularist element comes in. He talks about, race back then. So the Nazis, they were particular about race, ethnicity, nationalism. These are the things they became very particular about. And that is something, this particularism is something that's typically, at least as we see it now, is a grievance toward another group that is giving the group that is in power moral justification to harm the group and do horrible things to the other group. So you see Jews in Germany, you can see it today, that the grievances, the oppression, they're saying, these oppressed classes give them, the right to oppress others effectively, or they're not oppressing others, but it gives us the right, the people in power, the right to oppress others and create, real
name of equality.
Exactly. So it's normally this resentment pointed at another group that allows them to gain power by saying we ought to hurt them because they've been oppressing you for so long. And then the fourth point is the worst get on top when the ends justify the means becomes the supreme rule. So we talked a lot about the phrase ends justify the means, which is, an immoral rule for people who believe in, free markets and freedom and liberty and individualism. But it is the supreme rule for those people who advocate for planning. They must use any means necessary to get to their ends, because when you plan, you have to fix the ends to make sure you can get there. And you begin to understand that not everyone has to be given the same stuff at the beginning in order to reach a similar or same conclusion. And that's where you justify doing really, really horrible things to people who you see as that they would end up finishing on top. It's a backwards way of thinking. It's something that we see very common in a lot of these collectivist movements that move to totalitarianism.
Yep. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. We're actually going to, at the very beginning, talk about the ends and means kind of system and how that works, particularly when it comes to the production and distribution of a manufactured truth. But no, that's exactly right. So
excellent. So we're in chapter 11 now, the end of truth. Already there, you can tell that the title, like I always say, I love the way that these are titled for the most part. This one is already something on our radar, and we, just like the last chapter, we actually related a lot of this to Eric Hoffer's The True Believer book, because there's a lot of similarities between here, and they have a lot of the same foundings. Also, when was Hoffer's book written again?
Hoffer's book was written in 55, I think. And also, does it almost feel like the chapter 10 is asking a question and chapter 11 is the answer? Why do the worst get on top? The end of truth.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? I don't know, but I think Hoffer, I think The True Believer was 55 or 54.
Yeah.
You know what? Actually, I think it might have been 53. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah. So he like all the other chapters, he opens up with a quote. So the quote is from E.H. Carr, and it is, quote, "It is significant that the nationalization of thought has proceeded everywhere pari passu," which just means at the same time with the nationalization of industry. To me, this kind of reminds me of the the chapter in economics where we're going to limit everything to the economic sphere and it's not going to bleed into your life
Yep.
anywhere else. Well, no, you know, you nationalize industry. Very shortly after that, you're going to nationalize thought, if you will, because if you try to plan things where everyone has equal outcomes, you can't just limit that to economics because we're not machines. You know, if we are computers, then sure, you could reprogram us and allow us to end up in the same place, but we're not. We're also social creatures. We have thoughts, we have ideas, we exchange with each other, and normally the people with the better ideas end up on top very often in a free market of ideas, if you will. But you know, when you nationalize something, if you're going to take this one sphere and say, all right, this is the government's job to provide you the security, that authoritarianism, that coercive power is going to bleed over into everything else eventually.
Yeah. So first off, I was super close. It was 51. So none of the numbers I said were right, except for the 50. But yeah, so 51. And before I get into this first quote, as often as the case, Hayek is laying a case and building a foundation of an argument and giving, you know, kind of a lot of times what Hayek will do is in a roundabout way make a claim, then spend a lot of time filling in like the why and the evidence of that claim, and at the end he'll put a fine point on that claim. And this chapter feels very much where he's laying out the necessity of why there is a need to manipulate truth, why there is a need to use propaganda to universalize truth and facts and theory and whatever. We'll get into what that means specifically here in a minute. And then the consequences of what happens when you do that, and then fleshing that out. But he does a good job of explaining why you have to do that. And so here's this first quote, and we'll see how I think we're going to get into some good exposition of the why here. But he says, although in a planned society, the beliefs must be chosen for the people and imposed upon them, they must become their beliefs. So those beliefs must become the people's beliefs. A generally accepted creed, which makes the individuals as far as possible act spontaneously in the way the planner wants. The skillful propagandist then has power to mold their mind in any direction they choose. And even the most intelligent and independent people cannot entirely escape that influence if they are long isolated from all other sources of information. So what he's saying here is, you know, one of the themes that we've walked through a lot in this book, and is that planning, which, you know, collectivism, whatever, and we've given our definitions. Planning is basically just think top-down bureaucracy, controlled society. If we even use the word liberal, I don't know if we do in this chapter or not, but liberalism, if we end up, that's like classical liberalism. It's, you know, think modern conservatism or libertarianism. But planning operates under, you know, what Hayek calls the fatal flaw of planning. And that is, you have these people who want to control society for some, you know, contrived, maybe authentic, probably not, morally virtuous means or morally virtuous ends. And they think everyone will agree with them. And so they'll use vague terminology like the common good, the common welfare, the greater good, whatever, justice, social justice. And then once they get into the specifics of what they mean by that, people are like, whoa, I don't know if we're on board with that. I think the example he gives earlier is this. It's like if a bunch of people agreed to take a trip, but they didn't decide where they were going to go. And what you end up with is most of the people who are going on that trip end up in a place they never signed up to be. Just because they initially signed up for the trip based on really vague, you know, rhetoric of the greater good or something like that. And so what Hayek is expanding on here is the point that it's not good enough if you want this to be sustainable, or as sustainable as something like this can be. If you look at North Korea, it can actually be very sustainable. But if you want it to be sustainable, you can't be satisfied at this surface level of propaganda or persuasion of them just agreeing to some kind of vague notions, you know, or vague, you know, outline of the greater good. You have to get them on board with all the aspects of it. And they also need to be able to spontaneously generate the thoughts that underline like that thing. And so it's almost like Inception. Like it's not good enough to just persuade people or coerce them to go along with it. They need to do it even without, once the overt mechanisms of coercion, or including like violence or whatever, are removed. They need to think that this is their idea, this is what they want to do. And so one of the things that he addresses at the very beginning is that one of the things that you might see, or that he encountered in terms of arguments against him, was like, well, advertising agencies use propaganda. And because Hayek is saying, look, the propagandist uses propaganda to get people not just on board with the vague stuff, but also with the specifics and the means. And we'll get into that here in a minute. But people would say, I mean, anyone who's watched Mad Men, Don Draper, right? Like, this is all about the propaganda of the advertising industry. Of course, this is, that's a much later in the timeline than World War II. But the point is, Hayek says, look, if you have competing propaganda, that's not the same. Coke versus Pepsi is not the same, right? Because those are competing ideas. Those are competing products, and people can choose. People, at least, that's a way. It's like, whose propaganda is better? What Hayek is saying here is that what a planned society includes is everything is the same propaganda towards the same end. And so he's like, they have to be isolated. So he says, I mean, to read it again, independent people cannot, even intelligent and independent people can't entirely escape that influence if they're long isolated from all other sources of information. So if you have competing propaganda, you have competing sources of information. In a planned society, you have one source of information, that's this hegemony, right? So even if you look at how we are today, and I know we're going to get into some of this later in much more detail, but we have a hegemonic society of information today, right? All of these institutions agree with each other. And so there's no competing information. This is one of the places where I think that Ben Shapiro or PragerU or whatever is actually really useful. Is that, I don't think they're useful in real practical terms, for people who already understand what's going on. But if you're someone who just like kind of red pills, for lack of a better term, and you're like, what is going on? And you're starting to fight those default settings, as Bridget Fetisi talks about. The default settings is, you're born into society, and unless your family is conservative or something like that, everything tells you, your family tells you, the entertainment tells you, school tells you, everything that the Democrats do is good for the most part, or that the left does is good, and then the right are the bad guys. And so once you start to awaken to that, get woke, so to speak, you're like, wait a second. So all of these perspectives I have, I've been isolated from all other sources of information, all other perspectives on these issues. What is the other side of that? And so that's where I think like Ben Shapiro, PragerU, even Steven Crowder has some good videos where people can go, oh, there's another side of gun control. There's another side of crime statistics. There's another side of economics or the welfare state or whatever. And so those are really useful in providing people with, another source of information, whereas they've been isolated from those sources of information. But that's kind of the groundwork that Hayek lays here, is that he gets into, it's not just good enough to get them on board with a vague thing. You have to get them on board with everything. So that includes whatever means you propose, all the ethics, all the morals, everything. And there cannot be competing sources of information, whether those be practical or ethical source of information.
Yeah. Something I often say, especially when people say, "Oh man, this movie failed," they're like, "Why did this movie do so bad?" And a lot of times, the movie has fiction in it, or let's say a movie that replaced an all male cast with all female cast. They say, "Why did it perform so poorly?" My answer typically is, even for a movie that's completely fiction, cartoon, whatever it needs to be, completely fiction, there has to be some part of truth in there to make it believable, to have the person buy in. When something's completely fiction and there's no tether to truth, the movie's just not good, because it doesn't come together properly. If you're going to replace an all male cast, all female cast, and they act just like the men do, even for someone who's super woke, they see that and they're like, there's something not quite right here. I don't believe they would act this way. You're not making me believe that this character you made up would truly make this decision here or act this way here, I don't think the movie's good because I'm not buying into it. That requires, so when we see that requires some baseline of truth. You have to know truth before you establish that relationship. What they do here with this type of propaganda is they isolate the truth and they send it out. They don't allow it to come inside. So there is no baseline these people can jump onto. That is why you can form alternative realities effectively. This is why LeBron James can say a black guy can't worry about stepping outside his front door without getting shot by a cop, when we have, FBI data here that says that's not right. That's not even close to being right. But he can say that, and it's pushed by the media because they isolate out the truth. They're not going to, show the war on cops or any of this stuff, any alternative narratives, or even if you say competing propaganda, they're not going to show that. They're going to completely shut it out. They're going to suppress it. Something we'll get into later. They're going to suppress it. And there is no baseline that the average person can establish to see if this particular set of facts, let's say, line up with reality, because their reality has been completely basically terraformed. And now they have nothing to compare it to. They have no baseline there. So I think this is a little bit of what he's getting into.
It's not good enough to just lie to someone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you lie to someone, but they still have the truth available to them, then they can determine whether or not you're lying.
Mm-hmm.
So exactly like you said, they have to be isolated from the truth. There is my cousin knew a girl, I think I might have told you this once, who her parents successfully convinced her about the existence of Santa Claus until she was like 15 or 16. Like, it was that long. Because right.
I know younger audiences.
Right. Hey, I just saw Heat. there's an old Jim Gaffigan reference for it. So, but one of the ways they did that is they made sure that no cousin, no friend, anyone, no parent told her that we don't believe in Santa Claus. So she was completely isolated from an alternative perspective. She was like, I mean, I guess, and it was that long. And her parents were still pissed whenever someone finally told her, like, this is immoral. Like, that's like, it's like, you can't go full Andy Kaufman with your kids. Like, that's, you're going to totally screw them up. They're going to be like, okay, wait a second. So is Asia real? Is that a real place? Like, they're going to get to a point where it's like, wait a second, hold on, gravity.
Question everything. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but anyway, but that's the point, is it's not good enough to just lie to someone, because then they still have the competing narratives. You have to isolate them from the truth. And so then it's like, you can tell them whatever you want.
And as we'll get to in a little bit, I mean, what happens when you suspect a lie? You go to the Google machine, you type something in, the first results are CNN, NPR, New York Times, Washington Post. How far do you get down the list before you get someone who might give you an alternative view on this?
This YouTube channel.
Digging. Exactly.
Or,
Subscribe. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Well, no, do it. But it's hard to find truth. And that's the whole point, is you end truth by digging it so deep into the ground that no one can ever find it anymore.
Well, and that's the Brandolini's law, right? Brandolini's law is that for every lie out there, it's kind of an extrapolation on a lie makes its way around the world before the truth gets its shoes on. Brandolini's law is that for every lie, it requires an order of magnitude more truth to debunk that lie. So if you have a lie that's a sentence, you need a paragraph of truth. If you have a lie that's a paragraph, you need a chapter of truth. If you have a chapter of truth or a chapter of a lie, you need a whole book of truth. And then, but what happens if you have a volume of books of lies, right? Like, and so we're so inundated with lies. It's like, even just trying to explain to someone why a very simple thing, and we'll get into some of the contemporary context stuff, I'm sure, later, but where it's like the amount of time required is like so overwhelming. And that's just to even get them to go, okay, maybe on that one thing. And then there's like 14 things connected to it. And then it's like, okay, how much time do you have? Right. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we're going to get in the next section, which goes through kind of building a moral code, which I think this, is super important, because it's not exactly, they don't build this anti-moral, framework. That's, again, there has to be some truth in there, and they have to make you believe that you've believed this the whole time.
Yep.
So he gets into it here, quote, if its object were merely to teach people a definite and comprehensive moral code, the problem would be solely whether this moral code is good or bad. We have seen that the moral code of totalitarian society is not likely to appeal to us, that even the striving for equality by means of a directed economy can result only in an officially enforced inequality. Talked about this before, an authoritarian determination of status of each individual in a new hierarchical order, and that most of the humanitarian elements of our morals, the respect for human life, for the weak, and for the individual generally, will disappear. However repellent this may be to most people, and though it involves a change in moral standards, it is not necessarily entirely anti-moral. They are destructive of all morals because they undermine one of the foundations of all morals, the sense of and the respect for truth. That you have to eliminate truth here, and you can build a moral framework that makes sense to most people. So to me, this kind of reminds me of the last chapter, that I talked about in the brief summary, referring to the moral basis and moral results, except for this further explains that transition period between the two, that there must be a moral code change in order to convince the populace that the moral basis and moral results are interchangeable, that they're the same thing, and that truth is an obstacle in that transition period. So you cannot build these moral standards and just completely lie and just say, okay, we're going to believe up is down, left is right, black is white. You can't just go in there and say, okay, we're believing the exact opposite of what you believed before. You have to make them believe and move the goalposts a little bit using several different institutions, something we'll get into later, and make them believe. Like any good salesman will pitch something to you, and they're going to try to make you believe that you came up with the idea to buy this thing. They brought you in, but a good salesman can convince you that you came up with the idea to get this thing, or you're going to come up with different ideas as how you can use this item or service. That is what they're doing here. They're trying to give you these new moral standards and make you believe you believed in this the whole time, right? And that's extremely important to making that sure that gets ingrained in your culture, gets ingrained in how you operate. So when they do have these immoral results, you're not going to bat an eye. You're going to be like, oh yeah, we're looking for that the whole time.
Yep. So here's a question. I know this wasn't originally in the notes, but I think that he just made a really huge assertion. Mm-hmm. And all of our discussion from here is engaging in that assertion. And so we I think at least need to pay a little bit of attention to it. So whenever he says that all morals, or one of the foundations of all morals, is the sense and respect of truth, let's at least address why is a sense of truth and a respect for truth the foundation of all morals, of every, if we're going to say morals is that which is good, virtuous, right in some kind of, I don't know, ontological sense is right, but philosophical sense is right. Why is truth so necessary and vital to the point of it being a foundation in all morals?
I think truth has a lot to do with the measuring stick you use to see if an outcome or result is moral or immoral. You have to know the truth about that outcome in order to establish or measure to see, what that result actually is. And if you can hide that truth, if you can say, we had the war on poverty, and then hide the truth that poverty just gets worse, and the reliance on government just gets worse as you are at the front lines of that war on poverty, it makes it easier to sell it because you have that moral basis, that moral foundation to be like, well, we want to fight truth, that's moral, and the actual moral results are something where it's going to hide and say, if you keep giving us power, we're going to keep making it better, even though it's just the trends showing it's getting worse. That's the truth. The untruth here is, well, it will get better if you give us more power and we can do these things more effectively. So I think truth is it's the only measuring stick you can have while building a moral system and actually analyzing the moral results.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Truth, would you say that at least in this case, truth is synonymous with reality?
Yeah, you have to have a reality.
Truth is the way things are. Truth is how it is.
Exactly.
And that includes the inputs and outputs of those things. And if morals is the measure of, how are we doing it, if we're aiming at how we think things ought to be, morals are maybe the guide, the framework that we use to even conceptualize how we think things ought to be, right? And then we take action to move in that direction. Truth, like you said, is the measuring stick. It's the metrics. It's the feedback mechanism to tell us, okay, how are we doing at that? How are we doing? It's what are the moral results, of what we're aiming at? And so if you get rid of truth, then you have no way of determining if what you claim to be striving for is actually occurring. And so I think that's really important to lay out here. If someone says, gosh, it's really bad if you get rid of truth, I think most people would agree with that statement. But it's not just some simple thing about, well, should you tell the truth or whatever? It's that this is a fundamental aspect of building a society that works, and not just on a macro level, but building relationships that work. They have to be built on truth. Was it Eliza Schlesinger just came out with that movie based on do you know about this? She wrote this movie and did it didn't get very good reviews, but it's based on a true story. It's almost verbatim a true story of something that happened to her, where she wound up in a relationship with this guy that was completely a lie, where he made up all this stuff about going to Harvard and his mom had cancer and he did this and lived this out. Like, I don't remember what it's called, but my wife watched it. She was on Rogan a couple weeks ago and she talked about it, but this totally happened to her, where she wound up in a relationship with this guy and everything he told her was a lie. Right. And so truth is how we establish, like, again, that framework of what are our goals in this relationship? How are we doing at that? What are our goals in this society? How are we doing at that? So it's absolutely necessary. So sorry to deviate a little bit there from the notes, but I think it's important to establish why truth matters. It's what we use to determine whether or not what we're doing is working.
Yeah. And there's some great irony in that statement too, why truth matters. There's not one person in this world who I think, if you said, does truth matter, that they would answer no.
Right.
I think just about, everyone who's not a crazy sociopath or something, would answer yes. But then the change you can have in there is the redefinition of words. Something, again, we'll get to later, is like, you can redefine truth in order to make it seem like truth is just whatever makes things equitable. Truth is whatever doesn't hurt people's feelings. Truth is whatever serves the plan is truth now. And that's an easy way to manipulate by ironically using untruth to define truth, that allows people to believe that, even if it's not empirically true, that, you get LeBron James quote that if you walk outside as a black person, walk out your front door, that you're automatically in threat of getting killed by the cops, even though it's not empirically true. It sounds right. It fits a good, well-rounded narrative that they got going, and it allows them to garner more power to make sure that if it were empirically true, that they'd be able to stop it. And that's the whole point.
And it's an assertion that is frightening to push back against.
Yeah.
Right. So even for the person who goes, I don't know about that, it's sufficiently dangerous as a claim that most people are like, I don't feel comfortable pushing back against it. So it makes this false sense of being true, even if it's not. And there's that terraforming aspect. So to go back, just to reiterate one of the aspects of the quote that you read a minute ago, you said, though this changing of things involves a change in moral standards, it is not necessarily entirely anti-moral. They are destructive of all morals because they undermine one of the foundation of all morals, the sense of respect for truth. And this idea about how, look, the way that they change this stuff, and you just alluded to it there, it's not anti-moral necessarily, just because they're getting rid of our contemporary understanding of what is moral or good or right or virtuous or whatever. It's not anti-moral. And it reminded me of that quote from Eric Hoffer, where he says, though ours is a godless age, it is the very opposite of irreligious. And so, it's like you could just supplant some of that verbiage in there and say, look, though ours is an immoral age, it's not anti-moral. It's just that they have created this new set of morals. I mean, look at the arguments, look at what the foundation is of any of the main culture war, again, for lack of a better terminology there, conflicts that we have on a societal level, they're all morally based. Wear a mask, go get the vaccine. Don't you care about the common good, the greater good? I mean, that was the who is the quote? Sam Harris. I think I sent that to you. What we have here is a fundamental error on people's part to get on board with the greater good. I mean, I think that's what I texted you. Sam Harris said that, and so
It's the flip
Black Lives
side
Matter.
of,
You don't care about Black lives. I mean,
right.
all this is wrong. So sorry, on the flip side.
Well, what I was to say is that Sam Harris quote is just the flip side of, you guys need to stop worrying about all your liberties and freedom and care about other people.
Fuck your freedoms.
Yeah, the only way you can carry, as he's established in previous chapters, is individual freedom is a prerequisite for everything else.
Yep.
Once you stop caring about that and you only care about the collective over individual freedom, well, now whoever runs the collective is going to be the one getting all that power. You actually have to aggressively worry about yourself and your family. And I'm not pitching the Ayn Randian be selfish is a good thing type of stuff, but I am pitching the individualism is actually a pretty good thing. Whenever someone says you need to worry about the collective more than yourself, they're selling you a false bill of goods there. They're trying to gain that coercive power from you. And the worst thing you can do, which a lot of people are doing today, is volunteering that power.
100%.
And
demanding you do the same.
Exactly.
And demanding that you do the same. I did it. I got on board. I did my part. That's the thing you're hearing a lot these days. I did my part. Okay. So here's this quote: the need to rationalize the likes and dislikes, which, for the lack of anything else, must guide the planner in many of his decisions, and necessitate and the necessity of stating his reasons in a form in which they will appeal to as many people as possible, will force him to construct theories. So what he's saying here is, in order for the planner to rationalize what he's doing and just the specifics of what he's doing, he's going to have to come up with theories. Because again, it's one thing to say the greater good, right? Once you start to get into the actions, now we're in specifics, and people are going to be like, what about that specific or this specific? So now you're going to have to come up with a scientific basis for the specifics of what you're doing. So he says you're going to come up with theories, i.e. assertions about the connections between facts, which then become an integral part of the governing doctrine. So you're just going to come up with all these contrived, formulas of, this, trust the science, believe the science, worship the science, or the widespread dislike of the individual civilization and a romantic yearning for country life, together with a probably erroneous idea about the special value of country people as soldiers, provide the basis for another myth, blood and soil, for example. That was a World War II, especially Nazi Germany, expressing not merely ultimate values, but a whole host of beliefs about cause and effect, which, once they have become ideals directing the activity of the whole community, must not be questioned. So to put a fine point on that, the planner starts to act specifically. It might just be based on his prejudices, maybe not, but maybe so. Either way, he's going to have a ready-made rationalization for the public. And that ready-made rationalization is going to come in the form of some theories. It's not going to be an ethical code or a moral code. It's going to have to be grounded in some contrived statement of facts and theories. And he says here about how it's going to be values about the whole host of beliefs that cause and effect, or something like that. If we do this, then this. And that's what gets in where you talked about the moral values versus the moral basis versus the moral outcomes. It's the goal is not evidence of the goal, as Burnham would say. And so he's saying, look, once we come up with these theories, so we're not just talking about the ethics. Once we come up with whatever theories, right, wrong, based in prejudice, based in fact, doesn't matter. They are set in stone. They cannot be questioned, because if they're questioned, well, then we get some negative outcomes, which I think you're probably going to get to here. But
yeah, I find it interesting that he used the word theories here. I actually think this might be James Lindsay's favorite book, or going to be his favorite book, or I don't know. But I think
if he reads it, I hope so.
I think I just find it interesting that he used the words theories here, because we see it so much today, talking about cynical theories there, and just how this theory is kind of this blanket statement that allows you to make immoral claims but kind of build on a moral code, moral foundation behind it to make it seem like it's not as bad, and also makes you scared because of some of the topics they talk about, makes you scared to push back against those theories, right? But the theories we see today, the theories provide foundation for these myths, or you could even say they're just plain myths themselves, and can create a dogmatic ideologies that create the moral frameworks in the complete absence of truth. And this is really the bridge between facts and anti-truth or untruth. And it must not be questioned. Again, that last statement must not be questioned is extremely important, because, you know, there's the facts that, and this is I don't know if I put the quote down here, but I actually do really like this quote. So the fact here is a disparity found in real data. The theory is all unequal outcomes are caused by overt or covert racism, prejudice, discrimination, something like that. And for someone in the Claremont Review of Books was doing a review of Thomas Sowell's book, and he put this brilliant thing in there that all disparities are treated guilty until proven innocent.
Yep.
And it's that idea that no reasonable statistician or anyone who can analyze data would actually take that as true, because it just doesn't make sense. So there can be disparities for a million different reasons. There are all these variables in there, but what these people do is they bring that multivariate problem down into a single variable, and they just say racism is here. Now find out exactly where it is. And the result is you must force or fix or plan these outcomes to make sure that we can get rid of these evil disparities in there. So I think this is the theory here is that bridge between the facts and the untruth that allow them to get away with sometimes blatant lies, certainly an absence of truth in there, but allow them to also build this moral framework around it that insulates them from criticism and allows other people, other institutions, mainstream media, the universities, all these other institutions to also buy into that theory and just repeat those talking points and put that into the mainstream.
Yep.
Yeah,
I agree.
So the next quote here, I actually really enjoy. And I'll get into it here. So, quote, the most effective way of making people accept the validity of the values they are to serve is to persuade them that they are really the same as those which they, or at least the best among them, have always held, but which were not properly understood or recognized before. Something I kind of tried to bring up before is, you know, they cannot just say up means down, left means right, black means white. They have to say, this has always been here. I bet you believe that you just didn't understand it, but, you know, now it's here. I'm here to explain that to you. And now we can change this moral framework, and you're not going to skip a beat. To continue, quote, the people are made to transfer their allegiance from the old gods to the new under the pretense that the new gods really are what their sound instinct had always told them, but what before they had only dimly seen. So I think a good example of this is it's the switcheroo, right? It is convincing the Christians that Jesus was a socialist pacifist, or that the Democrats were the ones who were really against slavery and really against Jim Crow. The whole time they just were under the name Republican until their
Southern strategy.
Exactly. They're just under the name Republican until their marketing teams decided to switch names. You know, it's an old trick, but a useful trick. It is convincing you that you've just interpreted this story wrong. You just interpreted these set of morals wrong. And now we need to switch them and with a good old twist. And that's just what you believe the whole time.
Yeah. It's a lot harder to just come up with new words, right? I remember posting about this on Ruben's locals, man, a year and a half ago, maybe. And about how like you can't, dude, I think even James Darian has talked about this, like James's, you know, I know we both really like James, but I think one of his ideas was we need to come up with new words whenever it comes to some of this stuff, or at least the conservatives need to come up with new words. I believe, I don't think I'm misquoting him. James, if I am, go ahead and correct me if you're not watching this and you can't do that, well, then I banged your mom. So anyway, but the point is his point was that you have to come up with new words. And what Hayek is saying, no. They will hijack the meaning of these words. And we'll get into what some of those are specifically, but they'll do that to convince you that you've always agreed with this. And I love how he uses, it's the old gods, because what do gods represent? They are these things that we are subservient to. And so values like justice and equality and whatever, those are the old gods. And he's saying, no, we're just going to redefine the old gods. That's why Lindsay does call CRT the lockpick into Western civilization, because we are so sensitive about race for good reason in a lot of ways. And so it's like, if you have something that people are already really sensitive about and really care about, like, what's more practical? Come up with some new thing to try and convince them to care about, or just hijack the thing that they already do care about, right? And so that's what Hayek is lining out here. And, one of the things that made me think of is about how, like, just one example is, I mentioned CRT, is they'll say, oh, this is just a modern iteration of the civil rights movement, right? This is even though in the CRT and introduction textbook, they say that they reject traditional civil rights and they want to do something else. But what you'll see, the Mott and Bailey defense is, no, this is just the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and so they
refer to a lot of the civil rights leaders as ignorant. If you read their material, like
right?
There's ignorant.
They have no
bad people, but they just didn't understand anything, and they were naive, and they thought this whiteness thing could go away, but it's ingrained here. It's here to stay, and there's no way to get rid of it. And they set up that framework. Sorry to derail what you're saying.
No, you're fine.
They set this framework up to make sure that this is an imaginary dragon that will never leave, because once it leaves, their power is gone, right? They cannot ask for power to fight this imaginary dragon if it's gone. So they are always going to set up a system where they're always needed. Their coercive power is used for your benefit. And if this dragon ever disappears, all of a sudden they're out of power. They can't have that happen.
Yeah, and it's not, if you don't see it, it's because it got craftier. Right. It got more covert. It's like those old memes where it'd be like a picture of like a tree in a park, and it's just, a regular picture. And then it'd be like ninjas. There's 13 in this picture. And of course, it's just a picture. There's no ninjas in it. Right. That's how they see this stuff. It's like, well, if you don't see it, it's that's how hidden it is. And that's why they use terms like you have to root it out.
Exactly. Did you know Larry Elder's a white supremacist?
Right. Yeah. He's the white face, whatever. Have you seen the clips of montages of how the LA Times is just like free?
Yeah.
I voted no. It was trending on Twitter today of people who are voting and recall about how they voted no and recalling Gavin Newsom. Again, what is hegemony, right? You have Joe Biden, whatever role he is, he's not president, but whatever role he is, coming out and saying that, well, we need to keep Gavin Newsom in power. It's like that piece of shit.
You say he's not president or he's not present?
Both.
Okay.
Hopefully that helps.
He's the first college in his family to go to institution.
No, hey, I'm the first college in my family to go to Mars. Hey, listen. Got a bad dude. So, but anyway, whenever Hayek talks about this redefinition of words, and this is one of the things that caused me to post this a couple years ago, is he says, look, here's the old gods. Now, of course, in Hayek's context, he says that the word that's suffered the most in terms of being redefined is liberty. Obviously, 80 years later, it's changed a little bit. But he also uses freedom, justice, law, rights, and equality. And, we can add new words like victim, oppression, science, for example. And these are the words that, like, here's one. I even remember before any of this stuff, people used to say, because science. Right? Or trust the science, or it's science. Like that was a meme, even, because it was just obvious of like, no, that's just
an anchorman, didn't he say, made a derogatory comment against women, like, oh, men's brains are 3 times your size. It's science.
It's science.
Like that's what they're doing. That's literally
exactly
what they're doing. They say an absurd claim that they want to be true and say it's science. Don't worry about it.
It's indisputable.
97% agree.
Yeah. They'll say there's a consensus, right? The scientific consensus, or this is an established fact, right? Or the opposite has been debunked. Remember how the lab leak thing was debunked? Anyway, but so
how dare you?
Yeah, how absolutely dare you? Go to school. But they'll use these words, and this is not something to gloss over. I mean, and he gets into the specifics. I think actually. Is it we're not going to get into the section where he talks about the brothers, or are we going to read that? Is it with the when they switch the words? I think we are going to read that. Never mind.
Maybe. We do get a
So
lot into the science and the change over there. He digs a lot actually into the science. So I was surprised again, like to feel vindicated from a guy writing in 1944
right.
is awesome, but horrible at the same time.
Feels good, man.
Yeah.
And so if we don't, I think it is in this next section. So I won't get into it. If it's not, then I'll bring it up later. In terms of the despoiling of language and how all of language becomes, these double meaning. Again, Orwell reviewed this book and went on to write Animal Farm literally a year after this was released. And then 1984, maybe 4 years after that, I think was 84, 59, perhaps, or 49, I believe, maybe. I could be wrong. You can check me. I was wrong about Hoffer, so who knows? But